Hello, my name is Tom. Welcome to my channel, Integral Views. First of all, a massive thank you to all my new subscribers. Thank you for watching my previous video on the Fabian Society. Many more of you than I predicted watched the entire hour-long deep dive into the Fabian Society. I tried to keep up with the comments, but I gave up after a while. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for subscribing. So this video is a follow-up to the last one, and it's another focus on the Fabian Society. But I really want to get an understanding of the ideology of the Fabian Society, because I think it's one thing to understand that this is happening, that this group exists. There are many similar groups, think tanks on the right, and more on the left as well. But what's really more important from my point of view is understanding the ideological position that they come at issues from and how they got there, and then how do we get out of that? What's next, right? Because we can say, oh look, you're not taking the full perspective, and you're wrong in this way, and your behavior is harmful in the way that you're acting collectively. But it's another thing to actually provide solutions. How do we move out of that? The drive of my entire channel really is to help in understanding the world, and then moving into better positions overall culturally, because I think we're facing a bit of a cultural crisis in the modern world, and I think that integral theory tools really help to get that understanding and will really help us to move out of it. Hopefully I can demonstrate the usefulness of an integral perspective in this video, looking at Fabian ideology. It is said that battles are won or lost in the field of ideas, right? So ideas are what drives outcomes for society overall. And you can see that in politics and on social media. So bad ideas can spread faster than ever these days on social media. And when you have closed echo chamber think tanks or communities online where people repeat the same ideas to each other, forever, indefinitely, basically, then some very bad ideas can come out of that. Okay, I just want to introduce, before we go forward, a couple of concepts. In my previous video, I introduced one, which was the difference between internal and external causation. And I want to kind of expand on that a bit to give an even better, clearer perspective on what's going on with the Fabian Society and just overall. So the first thing I want to focus on is stages of development. So these stages of development are well researched. They're perceived in multiple different developmental psychology models, from Piaget to Jane Lovinger and a number of others. I draw a lot on the work of Ken Wilber in systematizing this. Ken Wilber is an integral theorist and philosopher from America. And I think that the model that he pulled together really provides, just something that is second to none in terms of getting a clear understanding of reality. So, stages of development, right? These are stages that we develop through as human beings. We develop through these stages as we go through life. Not everybody develops through all the stages. Some people stop at in different areas, different stages. But effectively, when we look at people and do studies and ask questions of people on a population level, we see, over time, their stages develop through a sequence. And that sequence goes pre-egoic. So think about a baby, right, that hasn't developed a sense of self yet. And then it moves into egoic. So that baby recognizes that they exist and they're separate from the world around them, and their ego is then manifest, right? And then they move into community, also called ethnocentric. I made a whole video on this that you can find on my channel. Ethnocentric is when the ego, the individual, self-sense recognizes, oh look, there are other people, there are other egos, and so then they form communities, and like human tribes are a great example of this. And then after community and ethnocentric moves out into world-centric, and these are increasing spheres of perspective. So it's the ability to take increasing perspectives from pre-egoic, egoic, then ethnocentric or community, and then world-centric, and beyond that is integral. The difference between pre-egoic, egoic, community, world-centric, which we call all first-tier stages of development, and integral, is a big difference, because integral holds each of the perspectives of the prior stages, first-tier stages, at the same time, okay? So each of these stages of development come with their own patterns of thought and cultural manifestations. So within ethnocentricity, within ethnocentric community, there was a huge focus on the rules-based order and on religious doctrine, so on religion. And the reason for that is because when you come out of egoity, just me as an individual myself, and you move into a community, then you need rules upon which that community functions. Feudalism was very much a part of this community level or ethnocentric stage of development. After a while, we then developed out of that into rational or world-centric. So rationality is like a form of world centricity. And then with that came the Enlightenment, Newton, and the invention of truths that apply to everybody. So objectivity, effectively, right? Now, each stage as you go up deconstructs the prior stage. So in ethnocentric stage of development, you have religion, right? Because we need rules upon which we operate as a community. So you have virtues and sins, etc., standards of behavior that are expected of everybody to operate and work together as a community. But then science came along with the scientific method, and it went, okay, actually lots of those truths are not really true. And it created objectivity, rationality, empiricism, right? And so that was the invention of truths that apply objectively to everybody just as part of reality, right? And then, in another part of world centricity, postmodernism came about. And this is where the Fabians are. This is where the Labour Party are, okay? And what that did was it deconstructed objectivity, deconstructed scientific objectivity. So you can't say any longer that that's always true. It introduced perspective, the subject, into the equation. One way of putting this is, if you think about quantum mechanics, you've got a particle existing basically as a probability field until it is observed and condenses into a position in space and time. So there is this necessity for there to be a subject or a witness of an object. They are not separate. One criticism you could have of Newtonian physics and just pure objectivity is that it doesn't consider the subject, the individual. Okay, so now let's go to another concept. Okay, I'm nearly done with these concepts, so just bear with me. One more. So I want to introduce you to quadrants. So quadrants are a way of looking at reality, and effectively everything in reality exists in 4 quadrants, so 4-quadrant analysis, okay? And so here are the quadrants, and on the left you've got the interior, and on the right you've got exterior. So on the left you've got subject, me, the witness, and on the right you've got object, stuff that I witness, right? And then it's also split up and down. So on the bottom you've got plural, and on the top you've got singular. So if you look at, for example, the upper right quadrant, you've got the individual object. So that would be brain, organism, whatever, or an individual object, right? So whatever, a single object. And then below that, in the bottom right, you've got plural object, so objects, things together, right? Systems, etc. And then on the left, you've got the individual I, me, my psychology, my mind, my subjective experience. And then below that, bottom left, you've got our perspective, which is basically cultural perspective, right? So if you look at the bottom left, let's zoom in a bit. Fabians sit within postmodernism. So they sit here. And that has certain characteristics. And as I said before, these different stages of development, they happen at the individual level, but they also happen at the collective level and in society. So you have these cultural manifesting kind of ideologies, right? And I said that these different stages deconstruct prior stages all the way up to integral. So in the community, in the ethnocentric stage of development, right, you have this rules-based order, religion, etc., and that's deconstructed by modernity, by the scientific method and rationality. It's basically supplanted by it, right? And then that existing objectivity gets deconstructed by postmodernism. Okay, so I've spoken about postmodernism a little bit here. So let's just have a quick look at a definition of postmodernism. In the 1990s, postmodernism came to denote a general and in general celebrity response to cultural pluralism. Proponents align themselves with feminism, multiculturalism, and post-colonialism. Building upon post-structural theory, postmodern thought defined itself by the rejection of any single foundational historical narrative. This called into question the legitimacy of the Enlightenment account of progress and rationality. Critics allege that its premise led to a nihilistic form of relativism. In this sense, it has become a term of abuse in popular culture. I mean, so that's basically what I was talking about previously, right? Effectively, it deconstructs everything. It says there's no objective truth. Everything is subjective. And that's how you get gender ideology, where you can, have a look at someone's biology and say girl or boy, but then postmodernism comes along and says, no, there's no objective truth. It's all subjective. It's relativistic. And we need to consider the person's perspective themselves, right? The really interesting thing is when it becomes pathological, what it does is it completely excludes objectivity. And that comes with a number of different harms. And we really need to understand this in order to understand how we move beyond it, and in order to understand how Labour's perspective and this general ideology is harmful for society. We all know it's causing harm, we can see it, we know it is, but we need to be able to be specific about how, why, and how we move beyond it. So I'm going to provide an example of how this is harmful. It feels to the individual operating from this stage of development like it's good. So it feels like they're being ethical and everybody else is being harmful. But actually, they are being harmful, they just don't know it. So I'm going to tell you how they're being harmful. So when you deconstruct objectivity and you don't take that perspective into consideration, then what you do is you say nobody can be different to anybody else. This is what comes along with it, because you deconstruct everything down into no objective truth, no objective reality, no objective differences between people, and then that manifests as governmental policies that harm groups, harm people overall. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Practically, how does this function? At the moment, the Labour Party is effectively not distinguishing between the importance of the British people and serving the British people and everybody else in the world. So where this comes from is everything is externally caused, right? Now, when objectivity came about and applied some global kind of truths that apply across reality, it took the approach of equality. And what equality was equality of opportunity. It was, don't discriminate against people, allow people to be themselves, right? To be individuals. And so individualism grew, liberalism grew. The US Constitution was a reflection of this worldview. But then it moved into postmodernism, and instead of it being about equality of opportunity and meritocracy, it became everybody is the same. And because everybody is the same, if there are any differences in outcomes that we perceive, then it must be the result of an unfair external system, right? So when you come at an issue from everyone is fundamentally the same, which they're not, because you've deconstructed objectivity that would allow you to make distinctions between people, then you see every difference in outcome for people as oppression, as a form of oppression. I'll go through some examples in Fabian Society documents in a moment, but that's a really important concept to understand. How did they get there, right? They went from global perspective of meritocracy and equality into what's often called equity. Now, in Fabian documents, they call equity, they call that equality. But that's not actually what it was originally designed as, right? Equity is equality of outcome, basically. And original equality was equality of opportunity. And the reason for this is because the mindset, the whole operating rhythm, the whole operating system of the people who hold that worldview have deconstructed objectivity. They've gone through that stage themselves. So you move through each stage, right? They've gone into objectivity, they've seen flaws with it, and then they've deconstructed it completely and they haven't integrated it. It's been basically kind of rejected. Now the difference with integral, as I said before, is integral holds all these perspectives at the same time, concurrently. Integral is where you move beyond postmodernism, and that's the next stage of development. And it's very rare in society. It's maybe 2% of the population, something like that. Gradually over time, society as a whole develops through these stages of development. Right now, the leading edge in power is in this postmodern world-centric stage, and the next one is integral. When we move into integral, which will be a huge shift in culture, then we will see a massive difference across society, a much better, much more functional society. Each worldview fails, basically, at the social level, at the cultural level. It fails before it becomes completely unsustainable and then something else comes to replace it. So through, many, many years of wars and terrible kind of suffering through feudalism, the Dark Ages, then came science, the Industrial Revolution, which was rationality, first form of world centricity, and then came postmodernism, and next it's integral, right? And the reason we're having this real friction in society right now is because we're seeing what's been in operation in power in this postmodernist worldview fail on every front, economically, socially, basically every front you can imagine. It's failing in front of our eyes. We know it is, and we don't really know what's next. So at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about what's next. How do you move out of that into integral? That is effectively what my channel's about. Just quickly, the entire woke mind virus, as Elon Musk puts it, all of woke, gender ideology, critical race theory, all of that is postmodernism. So that's effectively what we need to understand. I spoke about this in my last video, but I'll go over it again quick. So the Fabian Society has a tendency, not just a tendency, but almost a complete reliance on externalizing causation. So a conservative bias would be internalizing causation, and that would be a focus on individual accountability, responsibility, individual behaviors based on incentives and disincentives. The left, the liberals, postmodernists, and the Fabian Society and Labour, they tend to be pretty blind to incentives and disincentives. You can see that in the immigration system, see that in what they are doing in many different ways. And they externalize causality, blames external causes for outcomes and solutions external to the individual. The example I gave in my last video, I'll give it again. Actually, let me give a slightly different example. Obesity, right? So when we think about obesity, is it caused by the individual's behavior? So the conservatives would say, well, it's your responsibility, your accountability. You need to act differently. Your behaviors are causing this. It's caused by you. And then the liberal bias, the Fabian Society, you see this in their policy documents, will come in and say, no, it's the environment you're in. It's because there's more access to fast food. There's more access to sugar. But then how would you explain in that context that some people suffer from obesity and some people don't? We're seeing obesity rise, which is correlated nicely with this ideology coming into power and basically being applied in policies across society. It occurs to me that I have spoken very theoretically and maybe not very practically. I'll get into the practical stuff using Fabian Society documents just in one moment. I want to provide one kind of example. So in my last video, I did a bit of a deep dive on this document here, and I spoke a lot about immigration. Effectively what that document does, and you can go and watch that video, I recommend it, I'm going to link to it at the end of this channel. Effectively what that document does is it says that, or the ideology, whether they know it or not, right, is that there are countries in the world who are worse off than Britain. And that must be the result of oppression, because they're not considering that there are objective differences between people that manifest with different languages, different cultures, different outcomes, different technology, basically everything, okay? And so because they don't consider that there are differences between people in the individual level, at the cultural level, in every sense, then they conclude that any differences that they observe, economically or in any sense, must be the result of oppression. It must be the result of those people not having the opportunities to manifest their lives in the same way as others. That is most certainly not true. And you can see that just by looking at, if you're a parent, you know, children are different, right? They're just different. Not just your children, many other children, they are. To say they're not is frankly ridiculous, okay? So that's, how this manifests as an immigration policy. And what that does is it says, our priority is not, basically their priority, because they're world-centric, is to everybody in the world, not necessarily just to the British people. So they don't prioritize British citizens. They're thinking, how do we correct these terrible systemic oppressive results, right? How do we change this so that other countries who have been oppressed can be equal to us? That's their priority. That's their mindset. And you see it within their policy documents. And this is true in so many different ways. This same ideology is how they approach every single issue. Go down the list, it's all the same approach, right? And the Fabian Society is basically one group of people who have that same ideology, saying the same things to each other in different ways in a closed echo chamber. Not being challenged, effectively, right? Well, I'm here to challenge you. I'm here to give you a different perspective and to make you think about your policies and about your ideology in ways that maybe you never have before. Just quickly, one last example of this prioritization of other countries at the expense of Britain, the Chagos Island deal. right? And then also considerations regarding reparations. Okay, now we get into the Fabian Society documents. The first one I want to look at, and I'm not going to go into as much detail as I did in the last video, right? But I just want to make it clear how this mentality operates. So the first one is this Nye's Lost Legacy. And what this does is it looks at sort of occupational health service. And really this is like a focus on sickness benefits. So people going out of work onto sick leave. And we have a big problem with this in the UK. Just to show how big a problem we've got with this in the UK, which is rising and rising, by the way, have a look at this. This says, people also reported 1.7 million cases of work-related illness in 2023 to 2024. This represents a 44% increase since 2010-2011, driven in large part by a 93% increase in work-related mental illness. 93% increase in mental illness. That's a lot. Okay, and this next comment says, exclusion from work is rightly a key focus for this government. The average number of people off sick long term in a year has not dropped below 2 million since 1994. And working age absence from work due to ill health costs the economy £216 billion and the taxpayer £43 billion in 2022. In response, the government has committed £3.5 billion toward employment programs to help get sick people back into work. Okay, that's the context. But of course, it's important to understand who it is that's going off on sick leave. The thing that I really found from this document was there wasn't really a focus on the individual groups, the reasons why, the interior reality, right? Interior causation of why this is actually happening. It's all kind of external. So they gather this data, and then in their solutions we'll see that it's all external solutions, external reality solutions, basically. Okay, so who is it that's going off on sick leave at these huge rates? Well, it's women. Largely, we do see men to a certain extent from the age categories 25 to 34. But if you look at the female category here, we see a lot of women going off on sick leave, 25 to 34-year-old category, but right through the age categories. Why are they going off on sick leave? Well, as was said in those comments, it's mental health related. Depression, anxiety. Clearly something's not working for women in this current society. Maybe we should understand what that is, right? Here's a perspective that might be interesting. The Financial Times found that women in the same age category that are going off on sick leave have become extremely liberal. So this shows a wide ideology gap is opening up between young men and women in countries across the world. Really interesting. So if you look at the UK chart, you see women in the red category, the red arrow, moving very liberal, effectively, in their political views. And then the young men, 18 to 29s, in the blue arrow, are not moving anywhere near as liberal, but they've still moved liberal. So we hear a huge amount in society about the manosphere and all of this toxic masculinity. But what we're really seeing in these charts and many others is that women are moving very, very liberal to extreme political positions. That's what the data shows. That correlates with women moving out of the workplace. Now, I'm not saying that there's a direct causation, right? But we should be considering, is there a link there? What is it in society that's not working? Clearly, this is not good. There's a big problem if you've got women moving out of the workplace for mental health issues. Something's not working for them. We should understand what's not working for them, shouldn't we? But you see, if you can't distinguish between differences, and the interior, right, internal causation, maybe ideological causation, and everybody has to be the same, then you can't really enter into the conversation around, are there some specific solutions, right? And on the topic of solutions, let's have a look at what that document recommended. Access to quality occupational health services, poorly integrated services. Both of those are externalities, right? So they're external causes and they would be external solutions, right? Intervention is not consistently preventative and proactive. Again, it's like, we have to do something that will prevent this externally. It's not about the individual, their behavior, what are they doing, their responsibility, their accountability. It's about exterior, right? Workers are not consistently supported, again, external support. Sick pay. Reformed statutory sick pay levels and eligibility criteria should seek to remove the financial barriers workers face preventing and recovering from illness and perverse incentives that push people out of work. Level. The government should raise the maximum statutory sick pay. To do this, it should yada yada yada. Now, the thing is, basically what it's saying is let's pay more. Let's make sick pay higher. But that would incentivize people to leave work. So when you don't consider internal causation, internal motivation, agency of the individual, right, then you're not thinking about these incentives and disincentives as much, right? Because basically it's nothing to do with the individual and their behavior. It's all the external environment. And if there's any difference in outcome, it's because of the externalities. It can't be because of the individual motivations, right? So then you're like, let's pay them more when they're on sick leave. But someone might think, okay, well, actually, I don't like work, so I'm going to get paid a lot if I just subjectively say that I have I'm not saying, by the way, that this is the case a lot of the time. I'm not saying that. But it's definitely the case that there is this incentive and disincentive thing, right? They mention it. So they mention perverse incentives, but then they go on immediately to say, let's pay more. It's just so weird. Okay, hopefully through this process, I'm providing gradually a clearer and clearer perspective of Fabian Society ideology. This is quite difficult because I've gone through 500 pages, loads of this stuff, just endless, right? So picking it out and being able to be clear is quite a challenge. Hopefully by the end of this video, I will have got to a point where I can communicate some clear things to really think about and understand, what is the mentality that causes this, right? This is so important, not just in understanding Fabian Society, but understanding what's happening across society, right? So anyway, the next publication by the Fabian Society we're going to look at is Equal Footing, Why We Cannot Afford to Ignore Inequality by Annalisa Dodds. This paper says Labour's Race Equality Act will introduce ethnicity pay gap reporting and other measures to tackle structural racial inequality. Now, we have to know what they mean by inequality. What they mean is the same as what they do with the pay gap, which we'll get into in a minute, which is you look at all the data, and then if there's any differences in outcome when you split by groups of any kind, then that's inequality. It can't be, it never can be, differences in capability in different areas among groups. Why not? Why can't it be, right? It's really weird. I mean, at the end of the day, we see that expressed in sport all the time. Just go look at the NBA, for example. There's many examples of this. That's how reality actually works. You might not like it, but that's how reality actually works. It would be lovely if everyone was just the same, but they're not. They're not just the same, okay? And as a result of them not being just the same, you get differences in outcome when you look at different groups. So what this new Race Equality Act will do is it will look across all different jobs, and then it will see, oh, some people are performing better than others. What we see, for example, is people that come over from Eastern Asia perform better in certain ways, and they have higher socioeconomic standing. Are we then to say, well, I'm so sorry, but because that's not exactly equal with every other ethnic group, then you can't do that, you can't perform better, not allowed, you must be the same? See, this is why it's so pernicious, because it comes at it from a perspective of being ethically and morally right and good, but actually what it ends up being is discriminatory. It manifests as active, overt, institutional discrimination across society. Labour and all of society must understand that this is what's happening. Next it says, perhaps the clearest lesson from comparative analyses is that tackling inequality requires champions with sufficient structural power in government to deliver change. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to use authoritarian power to force discrimination so you get equal outcomes. Ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting would also help ensure that affected groups are paid fairly, while also encouraging greater efficiency in pay systems for all employees. What they mean by fairly seems to be the same as what happens with the gender pay gap. It means the same, not dependent on outcome, not dependent on capability, but just the same. The political right appears to be fixated with talking about equalities issues, but it seems only ever in a way that pits different groups against each other. This pamphlet has set out how this approach has damaged the UK's reputation, above all, held back our economic potential. So this is an interesting one, right? It's saying that the right is pitting people against each other. Ultimately, what's happening is the right is distinguishing between people and their capabilities, recognising their differences, largely, not completely, because also on the right are racists. They do exist, but they're not the majority, they're a vast minority. Labour says anyone at any time that says that there are differences between groups of people, there are differences, which there are, fact. But if you say that, then you're a racist. That is a very problematic point of view. Let's go further. Office, I'm not sure exactly what they mean by office, didn't catch that, but anyway, some office, I guess governmental, has just two, I think Home Office has just two flagship programs for women. The first, an initiative to get new mothers back into science, technology, engineering and mathematics jobs that has yet to get off the ground despite being launched twice in 2 years. And second, a pay transparency pilot which has been quietly sidelined and will no longer be a standalone program. Okay, maybe new mothers don't want to go into mathematics. Maybe when you force mothers to come away from their young children, their very young children that they want to care for, just maybe, and force them into mathematics and engineering, maybe that causes them to become depressed and then go off sick on benefits. Maybe it causes them anxiety and mental health issues. I mean, personally, I think society should be structured in a way where we're not constantly causing this issue, we should be supporting way more than we currently are. We should be supporting mothers hugely, not just mothers, fathers as well, but in particular mothers, because we have a fertility rate crisis. We're not sustaining our population, not sustaining it. So, ultimately, I just feel like that perspective hasn't even been considered whatsoever. There's this really dystopian element to all of this, right? And I'll show that with the next comment. So there is this very dystopian element to this, right? On average, rich countries are said to be losing some 15% of their potential GDP due to women's underemployment. Because of course, all that matters is GDP, right? GDP at any cost. In Western Europe, that would mean every country reducing its labour participation gap by 1.5% a year, which is what happened in Spain between 2003 and 2013, the strongest regional example of change. Even more bounded increase in female economic participation would lead to a boost to the world economy of $12 trillion in 2025. Great, because that's all that matters, right? Just economic growth, just GDP, chasing GDP, right? Whilst women go on sick leave for mental health issues. But anyway, they mentioned Spain, right? So let's have a look at what happened in Spain. So they talked about Spain as a golden example, right? Between 2003 and 2013. So let's have a look at what happened in Spain between those years. Now, the thing is, before we do this, I'm not attributing causation, okay? I'm just doing a correlation here. So there are many other factors, I'm sure. But we should be considering this. This should be part of our analysis, part of our consideration, right? So what I found in the Fabian Society documents is anything that doesn't fit the narrative is not considered. And I'm sure it's true in other think tanks too. I'm sure on the right in other think tanks, they're very selective in data as well. So primarily I'm saying we need to be more inclusive in considering different perspectives. That's where we need to actually end up. That's the problem we've got. We're not doing that enough. We're splitting into two different camps, and then they're becoming extreme, saying the same things over to each other, right? And there's very little cross-pollination of ideas, right? So anyway, back to Spain, this golden example between the years of 2003 and 2013, this great economic boost. So what happened for women during that time? Primary care diagnosis, Spain 2006 to 2010. Among women in primary care, prevalence increased markedly. Major depressive disorder, up 105%. Generalized anxiety disorder, 71% up. And multisomatiform disorder, I don't even know what that is, sorry, up 37%, right? Anxiety disorder up 71%. Depressive disorder, major depressive disorder, up 105%. Right within this Goldilocks phase, they say is a great example that other countries need to basically mimic, right? And then in the UK, we're seeing women drop out of the workforce in those lower age categories due to these same issues. Something's going on here. Medication use, national surveys, 2006, 2012. Again, this is Spain. The probability of psychotropic use among women rose by 16%, with female prevalence around 18.1% by 2012. Antidepressant consumption, context 2000 to 2013. National antidepressant use roughly tripled, with women the heavier users. Something is going on there. And I think that, maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I am. Maybe it's not this focus on everybody being the same. But I think it is, right? I really do. That's my opinion. That's my perspective. As a man, I do appreciate that, what do I know, right? But ultimately, I do feel like there seems to be some evidence that's kind of building up on this topic that correlates, at least it correlates, right? Might not be causal, but there's a correlation here. And how this operates ideologically is women can't be different from men. Everyone's the same. We've deconstructed objectivity, we've deconstructed biological sex and differences between groups and individuals. So everyone's the same. Any difference in outcome is the result of an oppressive system, externalities, right? And so then what we say is, well, everyone's got to act the same. So women can't have different desires, different goals, things that they care about, different behaviors. And so the expectation becomes based on the patriarchal system that was introduced, that was a capitalist system created by men, that is aligned with the way that men typically operate. And then we've said to women, okay, you now need to go into that, and you need to act just like men, and you need to like technology, and you need to like mathematics. And if there's any difference, it can't be because you're different, it must be because of oppression. Okay, this is quite controversial stuff, I know that, okay. Anyway, so I'm nearly done. So lastly on this paper, it says their current approach, and they're referring to a previous government, their current approach to the Equality Act is a case in point. 13 years after Labour passed the landmark legislation, it is still protecting people in countless ways every day. The legal framework it provides against discrimination by employers, businesses, schools, public bodies, and other institutions is one that many countries still lack and look to learn from. I don't think anyone's looking at the UK and trying to learn anything right now, to be honest. Okay, so they're actually referring to the Equality Act 2010. That's what they're referring to. Now, the Equality Act 2010, what it does is it has a couple of sections, right? Because we now see all of these diversity, equity and inclusion questionnaires in hiring practices and within businesses, making sure that they have equality of outcome at different levels of role. So this is institutionalized. The ideology has been institutionalized across corporations, across the public bodies, across society completely. So the battle we actually have is ideological. We have to understand and defeat these ideas in the realm of discussion, right? So that's what I'm trying to contribute toward. This is from the Equality Act 2010 that they're celebrating, okay? Section 159, positive action, recruitment and promotion. The tie-break rule, if candidates are as qualified as each other and people with protected characteristic or disadvantaged or underrepresented, an employer may select the candidate with that characteristic if it's proportionate. It's optional and can't be used as a blanket preference. Okay, Schedule 9, Part 1, Occupational Requirements, allows an employer to require or select for a particular protected characteristic only where it's an occupational requirement and a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, authenticity in a dramatic role, privacy in certain intimate care roles, certain religious posts, etc. Section 158 also permits general positive action, measures to alleviate disadvantage, but doesn't itself let you prefer one candidate over another in hiring. That specific hiring preference in Section 159. In practice, it absolutely does. That's what's actually happening. It's happening in academia, it's happening in corporations. I've worked in private industry and I've seen it myself firsthand. It is happening. And what happens when you try to apply for roles these days? What happens is this mess. This is a questionnaire, right? And pretty much every role you apply for these days has this because of HR departments, based on this legislation that's based on this ideology, this flawed ideology. So it asks you about everything, all your immutable characteristics, things you can't do anything about, because they want to equalize outcomes in every way they can, in increasingly minute detail. This one, for example, what gender do you identify with? How would you describe your sexual orientation? Why the hell does my employer need to know my sexual orientation? Is the gender you identify with the same as your sex registered at birth? How would you describe your ethnic background? Do you consider yourself to have a disability? Are you a parent or carer of child under 18? Are you a parent or carer of adults? Are your day-to-day activities limited because of a health problem? What's your religion or belief? And they ask you about what your parents did when you were a child, when you were a teenager. What was the occupation of your main household earner when you were about 14? To help you answer this question accurately, you can click on the question icon, an example of occupations. So what did your parents do when you were 14 years old? And my employer needs to know that. Why? because they're looking at equalizing through equality outcomes, right? So what it's saying is, well, if your parent was, good at something and was successful, then you need to be disadvantaged because that's privilege that you have that someone else didn't have, right? So it's just manifesting as discrimination. That's how this is manifesting. That's not how they intend it. They can't see it because they're in a trapped, closed ideology, but that's actually what's happening. So just quickly on the pay gap, the gender pay gap has been declining slowly over time. Over the last decade, it's fallen by approximately a quarter among full-time employees. In April 2024, it stood at 7%, down from 7.5% in 2023. Now, the pay gap, as they measure it, and as they're talking about it here, is you just look at all wages for women, all wages for men, divided by the number of men and women, and then you have a number, and then what's the gap between that number? It doesn't consider part-time work, doesn't consider different types of work. It's just gross, this number divided by them now. Right, okay. Now, when you control for different factors, so when you control for, and this is from the Office for Budget Responsibility, I think, or the ONS. I'll find out and I'll put it on the screen. So estimated pay gap, right? And then it goes age, controls for tenure, full-time or part-time, occupation. And what this shows is what percentage of the pay gap is controlled for, right? So look at the explained pay gap. That means when you control for all these different mechanisms, difference between part-time work, full-time work, different kinds of occupation, different tenure, different regions, and you control for all that stuff, different sectors, then you can explain a certain percentage of this 7% pay gap, this gross 7% pay gap. The percentage that you can control for and that you can explain is about 37%. And you can see that explained pay gap is up to about 37%. So 37% of the 7% is explained when you do this multivariate analysis, right? And what that means is you then end up with an overall all-age pay gap is 4.5% between men and women. And that's what we really should be discussing. Lastly on this, on the pay gap, I'm just going to show this quick graphic here. What I showed previously with the women going off on sick leave and mental health issues, depression, etc., they were in certain age categories, younger age categories. I just want to look at this 22 to 29-year-old category here, which is down the bottom in blue. And you can see that that pay gap actually, in some years, it goes negative, right? In some years, women in those age categories are paid more than men. But it's also very low just in general. It hovers around between 0 and 3 to 4%. And this is the gross figure. These are not the controlled variables. So if you control the variables, maybe it goes negative. Maybe it is, but the government doesn't release that data, right? Not on an age level, not that I'm aware of at least, not that I could find. But the point is that ultimately, the pay gap, if that's driving these mental health issues, right, that we're seeing, then you'd see that in this data. But actually, in those age categories, the pay gap is very minimal to non-existent. Before I go on to summarize this video, I want to just quickly consider the cases of Galileo and Newton. I want to do this to explain why it's so harmful for society overall globally for these echo chambers to exist, right? So Galileo was active, well, he was born 1564, was alive until 1642. In 1616, Catholic Church declares heliocentrism heretical. Galileo is warned not to defend it. 1633, tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant, sentenced to house arrest, dies still under house arrest. It wasn't until long after his death before his discoveries were actually accepted, right? So effectively what that is a system that oppresses the truth. It's a closed system of thought, an echo chamber system that rejects objective truths, and then as a result, it causes basically those ideas to not come out immediately. It slows down. Now let's think about Newton as a comparison. Newton, 1642, Isaac Newton, 1642, 1720 to 1727, 1665, 1666, Year of Wonders, develops calculus, theories of optics, etc., right? Then 1703 becomes President of the Royal Society. 1705, knighted by Queen Anne. 1727, dies, buried with high honours in Westminster Abbey. Completely different. The state apparatus accepted him, provided space for him to think, right, to apply his ideas, encouraged, embraced, and then his discoveries led to the Industrial Revolution that improved living standards around the whole world. So this was incredibly impactful, and a big difference that was caused by the institutions. One echo chamber closed thinking, the other one open, and Galileo was the unfortunate victim of the closed system. Newton was embraced and had a very different experience shortly after Galileo. Actually, Galileo died the year that Newton was born. Interesting. Hopefully I've managed to some extent to provide some insight into, Fabian Society ideology and these topics just, to a greater extent across society. Essentially, really, Fabian ideology is postmodern authoritarianism. So they got to a point where they're very postmodern. They believe in relativism, moral relativism, and they call equality of outcome, they call that equality. And effectively they will apply that through authoritarian control through all of our legal systems. And that's exactly what they do. That's what the human rights law does. That's what the Equality Act does. It's embedded throughout all of our institutions. So I think another really important part that really strikes me, and this is the important thing, right, is how do we move out of this? What's next? So let's say maybe there's someone from the Fabian Society watching this. Hello. So if so, this is for you, but it's for everybody else, right? So I think what really has to happen is we have to reach across the divide. We have to reach across political divides, across divides on social media, and listen to other perspectives and really try to consider. The thing is that when you do that, it's stressful. It's a stressful experience to be exposed to something that you're not comfortable with, that doesn't agree with your pre-existing narratives. It's not pleasant, right? But at the end of the day, even if the perspective isn't completely true or valid, maybe a lot of the things I've said aren't completely true or valid, but they're different perspectives, important perspectives to consider. And I think that we need to do a lot more of that, right? Just as society overall. Now, I spoke about integral to some extent in this video. I introduced some concepts of stage development, pre-egoic, egoic, community ethnocentric, world-centric. I introduced quadrants for the first time. On my channel, I will do deep dives just focusing on those concepts in the near future. Ultimately, what happens next, right? If you follow social ideology, you go from feudalism, you go from kind of warring tribes, feudalism, world wars, national wars, and then you move out of that into objectivity, rationality as a stage development. You move out of that into postmodernism. Integral is next. The difference is with integral is that it considers all perspectives simultaneously. So it sees the validity in postmodernism. It sees that yes, we do need to consider the subject, right? The witness, the consciousness involved, the individual. And we also need to consider objectivity. What postmodernism does is it completely deconstructs objectivity, objects, and it boils everything down into subjectivity. What needs to happen is both at the same time, right? And wave particle duality. So we must basically move into that mode. And so another example of how that differs, how does an integral perspective differ? It recognizes the validity of ethnocentricity or community in-group and out-group thinking, worldviews. They exist, they're valid, they have worth. They're not just to be derided, right? Which is what the Labour Party currently does, which is so divisive. And effectively they exist and they're good in their own stage, in their own state. And so they can be integrated alongside these other world-centric notions. And we do that by integrating these seemingly disparate worldviews and holding them all at the same time, using an increased perspective, increased consciousness that allows us to look back at all of these different worldviews and see them objectively. See, when you're within an ideology, that's your subject, that's yourself. You can't see it as an object, so you can't see the mistakes you're making. Only when you transcend it and look back on it can you see it as an object, truly. Which is why I'm able to have a look at postmodernism and that ideology that I've held myself in the past and move beyond and see it objectively and call out where it works and where it doesn't work. I'm focusing a lot on where it doesn't work because that's what's really important to move into the integral stages of development that we really need to move into as a society. Okay, thank you so much for watching another long video. If you made it through, thanks a lot. And again, to those new subscribers, thank you very much for subscribing to my channel. It's really appreciated. Please like the video if you found it interesting or useful. And please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Okay, cheers.